Alright, let's talk about a movie called Father Stu. Now, this movie is actually based on a true story. So you got this little boy by the name of Stewart and his father Bill, and they're showing a scene where he's singing and he wants to be a singer when he grows up or whatever like that, right? Turns out when he grows up, he ends up becoming an amateur boxer. Record of 13-2. But after the fight, he ended up being 13-3. So afterwards, he kind of messed up his jaw. He goes to the hospital, gets checked out, and we find out he got some molecular structures in his bones or whatever like that. And doctors tell him he shouldn't box no more. Now, at this point, he's there with his mom, Kathleen. His father's not really in his life like that no more. He went to California to try to make a name for himself doing work and things of that nature. So while Stu is contemplating his life, trying to figure out what he's supposed to be doing, he tells his mom he's going to go to California because he's going to be an actor. So he finally gets to California. He's excited about his opportunities and whatnot. He gets a little spot at this hotel. He tries to go for a bunch of auditions. Nobody's hiring him to do anything. Then he's like, well, I need to get a job now. So he ends up getting his job at the supermarket, and they have him in the back just cutting up meat and stuff. Basically a butcher. Then we got this one guy that's about to give him an acting gig somewhat. But at this point, he's like, what are you willing to do for it? Basically, he wants Stu to get on his knees, and Stu ain't having that shit. So he grabs him up against the wall, right? He's like, look, I'm trying to get an acting gig, but apparently you really want to see stars and shit. I'm like, so afterwards, he don't do nothing to him, he just walks out. Now, because you can see over the days while he's working at the supermarket, you can see him getting a little bit more frustrated. He's kind of losing a little bit of hope in his acting career stuff. Then he meets this lady in the supermarket by the name of Carmen, and he's infatuated with her automatically. But she don't really want nothing to do with him right then and there, you know what I'm saying? So he finds out from one of the cashiers what her name is or where she could have, could have been going or whatever like that. Now, she gives out these flyers all the time, but it turns out these flyers are like for a Catholic church. He basically finds the church, and obviously people right out the back are like, does he really even belong here? Obviously not. Then he talks to this dude by the name of Ham, who ends up becoming his best friend. He gets to talk to her a little bit, but, you know what I mean, with the charm and everything that he's expressing, he's supposed to be meeting up with her, because she works with Sunday school kids. Now, he's supposed to meet up with her the next day to teach with the Sunday school kids and whatnot, but he ends up going to a bar and ends up drinking. He gets into a fight with one dude, and he ends up driving home. Now, obviously, he shouldn't be driving while he's drunk. Cop pulls him over, he ends up getting arrested. He's not in there long, but he's in there long enough to miss Sunday school. And she doesn't even think they even were closely, right for each other at this point. So to put in context, Carmen is a Catholic Mexican lady who's pretty much been on her own and is always about the church. Now, Stu basically is trying to find his way through life, and we find out that his parents are actually atheists. Then we find out Stu had a brother by the name of Steven, but he had died at the age of 6. I never explained exactly. It said something about his body giving out on him or something like that. So now he's trying to do whatever it takes to be with Carmen. He starts turning his life around. He's about to admit himself from alcohol. He ends up eventually getting baptized. She doesn't believe in having sex until marriage. You know, all that good stuff. He's teaching with the Sunday school kids. He turned around himself so much that he was able to have dinner with her parents, and he learned how to speak Spanish. And they're pretty much boyfriend and girlfriend now. There's one dude named Chris that's part of the congregation. He's been hating on Stu, but we'll get back to him in a minute. He literally hates on him the entire movie. So it gets to a point where Stu is thinking in the back of his mind, he's not sure if he's good enough for, family and this, that, and the third, and he slips up. He goes back to drinking in this bar. So this guy next to him, he's talking to him about divine intervention and things of that nature. And then he tells him, don't drive, you know what I'm saying? It felt like he was trying to give him a fair warning of things to come. So Stu thought this guy was drunk off or something, but when he talks to the bartender said he was only getting water. Stu ends up leaving. He ends up drive. He ends up getting on a motorcycle. And then one car almost gets into his way, and then he ends up hitting another car, flying off the motorcycle. And then another car comes through and pretty much runs him over. I'm like, what the fuck? Crazy thing is, he somehow survived this shit. Now, he was in the hospital and he was in a coma for a little bit, but yeah. I forgot to mention, before all this, there was a situation with his dad. So remember when I said he got arrested the first time, and obviously he was trying to get a new car, but he couldn't have no money to impound his other car? He tried to steal his dad's car because he found out where exactly he was working at out there. Of course, that conversation didn't go well. But now back to current events. So he's in the hospital with his mother, Kathleen. Carmen was wondering what happened. I mean, she finally got the news and then she showed up. But this is the first time Carmen is meeting Stu's mom. And the moment she held onto his hand, with the Bible, all of a sudden, his eyes started moving. We're like, what the fuck? He ended up regaining consciousness, yo. While in and out of his subconscious, he was dreaming about the Virgin Mother, Mary. She talked to him about his purpose in life and about Stephen, his younger brother. So if you think this was the turnaround calling for him, well, guess what? It was. Now, his father did actually show up to the hospital, but it didn't feel like he was really there just to make sure he was for moral support. It felt like he was just checking to see if he died or not. I'm like, wow. And while Carmen is rolling the bed with Stu on it, this is when she first encounters Bill. And this is where we learned they were actually atheists, you know what I'm saying? But at this point, Stu's been baptized and everything like that. So, he basically had to get surgery, and about no time he was back on his feet. So eventually, at some point, Stu ends up getting back to the house. And him and Carmen had this deep-rooted conversation. Now, Stu at this point has been patient with Carmen, you know what I'm saying? He's willing to wait forever, you know what I'm saying? Whatever she wants to do. But Carmen, because she feels like she was going to lose Stu, she ends up breaking her vow and ends up giving him the business. Now, I guess to a certain point, Stu was contemplating everything that's going on in his life. and he invites Carmen to this restaurant, right? Now, she thought the purpose of it was to see if Stu was going to ask to marry her. Turns out, Stu actually wants to become a priest. So obviously, when you become a priest, you got to sustain from sex, drugs, alcohol, like forever. And because they already had sex, obviously Carmen was very distraught by all this. She wants to stand by him and she still believes him, but obviously she got thrown for a loop when he came to this conclusion. So he sends some money to the church by a guy by the name of Father Neil. They reject his application. He goes up there personally and talks to him one-on-one. Very convincing speech, obviously, but anyway, at that point, he ends up joining the congregation. He goes through all his trials and tribulations. Ham believes in him 100%. Chris, on the other hand, is still kind of judgmental. Then we get this tense scene when he goes back to the house, right? And Kaleem and Bill are there at the same time. It's really fucked up. They talk about his brother during the situation. Then his dad pulls out a gun and tells his son to shoot him with it. Because he feels like he's forgetting the ways of who he is. It's just, it's mind-boggling, This shit is wild. But obviously, Stu doesn't take it, and he just leaves out the house. So anyway, we have Stu preaching at one of the congregations, and she actually ends up seeing Carmen there. And Carmen knows that he's doing a noble cause, but she's still just frustrated at the whole thing. You think to yourself at this point, like, she's going to find somebody else to be a suitor, since she can't, ever have sex with him, because he's really trying to go full-fledged to try to be a priest. I'm here to tell you that doesn't happen, though. He goes through everything in priesthood. He's fully committed to this. Then we get a situation where he's playing basketball and he ends up falling, right? And every time Ham would try to help him up, he would keep falling down. You think to yourself, was something wrong with his leg? Turns out, when they took him to the doctors, they found that he's got some type of rare bone disease. So within like a year, arthritis will kick in, your face will be slurred. All these different type of things will happen to him to the point where he's not going to be able to walk on his own. Yeah, man, it's pretty messed up. So at this point, Stu is looking to God thinking, this is pretty much an ultimate test of his faith. But basically, this is even more of a reason for Stu to keep his faith. Does he get frustrated? Absolutely. The scenes where he's talking to himself inside of the church are just like downright eerie, So we see that he's still trying to be a part of the congregation and Chris is still hating, but at the same time, he kind of feels bad because you start seeing the effects taking place over time. They're showing a scene where everybody's saying, peace be with you, being able to shake hands. And Stu can barely even do it. And you see how he's moving his hand up like this. And you're just like, oh shit, it's starting to take shape. So eventually Carmen finds out about his situation. And she really wants to be there for him every step of the way, like honestly. Turns out she never really got with nobody. At least not that we know of. And throughout the times leading up to this, he would end up seeing his father again. Just at this point, trying to give him forgiveness and everything like that. Now, throughout this entire time, the father really doesn't make a turnaround until towards the end of the movie, but I'll tell you about that in a minute. So we get this one scene where Stu was in the church by himself going back to the congregation, and we can see his situation is getting worse. To the point where he's ended up talking to Father Neil, and Father Neil is feeling real bad about the situation that's about to happen, because the situation he's about to explain is not really up to him. They tell him, simply put, because of Stu's condition, and because they got to raise money for the church, they can't make him into a priest. You think to yourself, everything he's gone through after his body deteriorating on him and everything like that, and still putting in the word of Christ, it just sucks. And like the first time in his life, he just feels defeated. So he goes back into the church. His crutches slip off of him. He's basically crawling on his hands and knees. And then he just lays there. You don't know how long he's laying there. All we know is that his father gets a call. And it's like one of the first times Ham makes a call to his actual dad. And we see Stu still laying there in front of the congregation. So his father makes sure he gets him up. And at this point, they got to get him in a wheelchair. So Bill basically picked him back up to take him back home since he's not going to be a full-fledged priest. And he's spending time with his family. So then a couple of days later, it's Sunday, he's going to church. And his dad is actually taking him to church. But the car ends up breaking down. And he has to wheelchair him from the rest of the way. They meet their mom at the church, and the crazy thing is, out the corner of his eye, he sees Carmen there. So he's thinking to himself, his parents set this up so both of them can actually get married since he's not going to be a priest anymore or whatever like that, right? But that's not the situation. It turns out when they get inside the church, Father Neil is there too, along with Chris, along with Ham, along with Carmen and everybody else. And he's able to decree him and finally makes him a full-fledged priest. Afterwards, he gives his heartfelt speech, and it finally touched his dad, right? Then his dad ends up getting the car fixed and takes him to this retirement church home or whatever. And he basically becomes a pastor for that spot. Now, afterwards, you always see this line for everybody just to come and talk to him. Now, he basically has confession booths. Now, all the times before he became a priest or before he became anything, he would always go into the confession booths trying to figure out exactly what to confess about. Now, he's on the other side of it. Of all people to confess comes Chris. Chris tells Stu that he's sinned so many times, and we're like, what exactly is he talking about? It gets to the point where he says he was actually mad at God. He was actually mad at Stu for being better at his job, but he was actually just jealous of him. And there were times he thought about actually committing suicide multiple different times. The conversation was mind-blowing, for real. So Bill, throughout all this time, ends up getting back with Catherine. He ends up going to Alcohol Anonymous meetings and finally gets himself baptized. So it's like, wow. And trust me, the way Bill was in this movie, you never would have thought that would happen. And then towards the end of the movie, we get a couple little highlights of Stu's boxing career. We found out that he actually died at the age of 50. It was a whole lot to it, but bottom line is this was a powerful movie, yo. And like I said, it was based on a true story. Father Stu on Netflix, check it out.